This has been alluded to before. Doctors like chicken and egg questions. If you haven't gotten that so far, you should get it now. But what really does come first? And when we're talking about things like susceptibility factors, what are we really looking for? Are we looking for bronchiectasis susceptibility factors, this condition represented by what's called a bronchogram at the upper left-hand corner, where in the old days before bronchoscopy, they used to have people basically aspirate barium into the lungs and then do an x-ray to show this kind of finding. That was before we could do CT scans. But you can see these very exaggerated, dilated airways that don't taper down. Are we looking for susceptibility to the generation of this condition, or are we looking for susceptibility to acquiring mycobacteria that then causes the bronchiectasis to worsen? And in the bottom right-hand corner is what's called a fight stain from a bronchoscopy specimen where the cells are stained blue and the mycobacteria are stained red. And that sort of represents the microbiology of what we're looking for. We know a fair amount, actually we know a lot about susceptibility factors to the bottom right-hand corner. We have all of these genetic diseases associated at the NIH where there's severe susceptibility to mycobacterial infections. The only problem is that those patients don't look at all like the patients who get lung disease. For one thing, these patients that have genetic abnormalities in the part of the immune system that controls mycobacteria, they relatively rarely have lung disease associated with their condition. They'll get infections in the bloodstream, they'll get infections in lymph nodes and in bone. When they do get lung involvement, it looks very different from that top left-hand picture. It's not a bronchiectasis-associated condition. So what is it about people that get the lung disease that predisposes them to this? We've tried to take several approaches to this, but one of the things that has become more and more apparent is that there do appear to be genetic factors that might be in place that are conferring risk. And there's several pieces of evidence that suggest this. So these are actually from two separate studies. On the left-hand side is from a study that one of the fellows working with me published in Chest several years ago, where we identified these families that had small clusters of mycobacterial disease within the families. And the interesting thing is that, as you know, this tends to affect older individuals. And so at the time that the disease was diagnosed, in almost all of these families, they lived in very different geographic areas. So it's hard to say that they had regular exposure to the same water sources or that they had similar habits or similar environments that were conferring this. The other interesting thing is that many of these families had different species of mycobacteria that were recovered, but the patterns of lung disease appeared very similar within and between these families. And the other sort of final thing is that if you're used to looking at these, what are called pedigrees, where those dark circles and squares represent affected individuals, and if they're lighter or they have dots or stripes in them, they have some aspects of the disease, but not all of it. In many of the clear-cut genetic diseases, these pedigrees will be much larger. You'll be able to go back generations and go forward in generations and find affected members all over the place and be able to generate patterns of transmission of genes over time. In these small families, it was very difficult to say whether this was being passed directly generation to generation or whether generations were being skipped. And that's a very important thing to be able to note when trying to understand genetics of the disease. We've since expanded that to include other aspects of this disease appearance, this sort of tall, thin body habitus, this association with curvature of the spine, with abnormalities of the mitral valve, and expanded these families and now identified about 30 families where we see this recurring over time. And so with that number of families, and with the changes in genetic analyses, we're now to the point where instead of guessing at genes and kind of looking with this, we can go in and sequence all of the message parts of the DNA within these families without any preconceived notion of what the genes may be, and look for patterns of genetic changes that might allow us to tie this together. So if we're sure and within a family of who's affected and who's not, and we go through and we find abnormalities or changes in the genetic code that associate with being affected with this disease, that's a stronger case that those genes might be important risk factors. And so we're at the point now where we've sequenced about 30 of these families. We've sequenced a lot larger number of patients that are single individuals, not family members associated with it. And we've generated tons of data that we're now in the process of trying to sort through. So we're hopeful that in the near future we'll be able to learn more about what the genetic risk factors are. If we can get that information in many, many diseases like cystic fibrosis, an example, it may take years, but once you know the gene, it's a lot easier to get to directed therapies that get at the basic defect. The other thing that we've been able to do at the NIH, because of an ability to assemble patients with relatively rare diseases, is look at the rare diseases that are associated with this condition. And we talked earlier about the Lady Windermere syndrome, and I use this just as an example. This is actually a scene or a playbill from a performance of this play in London. And I think they got it almost right. It's actually not Lady Windermere who's in the foreground, but probably Lady Windermere's mother who's likely to be affected. But these are patients that get disease for reasons that we don't know. And on the medical side, we call that idiopathic disease. And so this is sort of the bigger circle in the middle. And the smaller circles around the outside are potential links to known genetic diseases. And so if you look in the upper right-hand corner, where it says Marfans. This is a genetic disease. It's a disease for many of the patients. We know the genes associated with it. We know the pathways that are involved. And it results in a very similar body appearance, this tall, sort of lanky, thin appearance. What's missing in that, or what has been missing until recently, is knowing whether these patients acquire lung disease that's similar. And work that's recently been done by a fellow that's working with me now, where she's basically reviewed about 900 of these patients with this syndrome, looking to see the association with lung disease. It does appear that they have a higher than expected prevalence of bronchiectasis within this group of patients. And so that's sort of one piece of interest, one piece of evidence of what a genetic link may be. This rare disease down in the bottom right-hand corner is a disease called Job syndrome. It's a disease where patients get recurring skin infection, sort of boils or abscesses. They get very significant lung disease. About 2/3 of them get bronchiectasis. This is a systemic immune system, but the gene that's associated with that not only causes immune-related problems, it causes problems in what are called epithelial cells, which line the airways. They're involved in a number of other tissues within the body. But it's only the patients with this syndrome that get bronchiectasis who acquire mycobacterial infections, and about 1/3 of these patients are infected with mycobacteria. I first got interested in this and first talked to Richard Wallace almost 25 years ago because we were seeing a large number of adults with cystic fibrosis at the University of North Carolina who got these infections. And we did a study looking to see how common it is in CF, and about 15% of CF patients acquire these infections. And so this is a very susceptible patient population when you consider that in the general population, this affects about 15, not per 100, but 15 per 100,000. And so what is it about cystic fibrosis that makes them susceptible to this? When you look at this population of patients with disease that's unknown, you find a very high prevalence of abnormalities in the CF gene, a very high prevalence of abnormalities in sweat chlorides, which are the diagnostic test for this. And so there seems to be a fairly strong overlap here. And then finally, the genetic disease down in the bottom left is where we've been concentrating a lot of efforts in the past several years. It's a disease called primary ciliary dyskinesia, which is about as rare or more rare than cystic fibrosis, but has a very similar prevalence of acquiring mycobacterial lung infections. And so by trying to understand these diseases a bit better, we're hoping that we'll learn more about what it is that predisposes patients to the lung disease associated with mycobacteria.